my dad first came to Maine, we had friends, and they were a relative out in Gardner on the 201 named Hickey. And my grandfather brought my dad when he was 10 years old, and 1918 was the first time that my dad came to visit the Hickeys on 201. And a man that my dad worked for at the Ford Motor Company in Somerville, Mass, was named Earl Potter. And Earl owned a house on 218 in Whitefield. And they worked together at Ford Motor Company. And that's how I think my dad actually came to Whitefield. My dad, we moved up for a year, and we had 2 farms here, so we did, our roots were here. My dad actually entered the service from this town. His name is on the memorial down in front of the church, Kings Mills. And he took great pride in, that he was part of this community. He loved, we all did. We loved this town. And of course, going across the road, just over that bank, it's quite steep down to the river. We cut steps into the bank and would go down to the swimming hole. And it was great fishing too, for trout.
Now, these trees weren't here, most of them, they were...
That tree my grandfather planted in the 40s, it was just a small... and there are pictures in the Historic Society of that tree at various stages. But there was right here where this marker is the highway marker. There was a huge maple tree here, and it was really the focal point of the house, the front of the house.
It must have gotten scorched in the fire.
And it's very possible, but it was pretty tired, just from old age. I mean, the tree was pretty well gone.
But these small pines, they weren't here at all, right?
My mother planted all of these pines on both sides of this road, and they were a foot high. My mother sold the place to Steinman for $8,000, and these people bought it for around $325 or something a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. But Mr. Steinman added a lot of property to this. He bought up some adjacent lots. But this is this was all clear. This was the farmland, haying, and up on this side road was a huge orchard that belonged to the Ford estate. My family, my mother and dad were, pretty close with all the Chases, and Dodd and Norman probably were closer to them than Chester, but Chester was busy with the mill and ran quite a business. And his dad, Harry Chase, I worked with in the woods in a mill one summer in the board yard with a fellow by the name of John Brand. He and I would take the lumber from when it was cut from the saw, and would take it out and stick it up in the board yard.
Lumber.
Oh, I'm guessing 16 or so when I worked for Harry. I never worked for Libby. Harry Chase was the only mill I worked in, and probably just for one summer. But he also worked, in jobs, haying and venial jobs around, And the brow, which they'd pull up with a tractor load and a scoop load of logs, and roll them off and down and a roller would put them on the carriage, and the sawyer would be up in there, and they'd lock the log on the carriage, and the sawyer, who in Libby's mill was named Henry Jordan, and he'd run the carriage back and forth and set the dimension. I forget exactly what they called it, but anyway, he'd crank this lever, and it would set the width for the board, and it would go through a single bladed saw on an arbor. And when I first went to the mills, it was driven by a belt to a Ford V8 motor. Very crude, very low production. And when the plank came off the end of the mill, then they were stacked up, and then a board yard truck would take those out into a field and separate them with stickins, they call them, to dry, air dry.
Mm-hmm.
But
and the
slabs,
yeah.
Pardon?
The slabs?
Slabs would be discarded off to the right, and a slab truck would then take them and deliver them to local people that would buy a truckload of them or whatever. A lot of them probably went to rot, but the slab, most of the slabs were used, and of course, Chase, they cut a lot of oak, which made a great slab wood. Libby cut probably primarily pine, box boards, and but most of what the Chases would cut were used for minesweepers. They were like, I can't remember the exact dimension, but the minesweepers, of course, they didn't want them out of metal because of the magnetism. And, the Atlantic was, pretty dangerous place back there in the war. I mean, these things drifting around and would ship, would hit it and blow it right out of the water. They changed speeds dramatically when the Second World War started. They changed the power to diesel, and the carriage basically stayed the same, but the production on thousands of board feet per day escalated to meet the demand for the Second World War. And instead of horses yarding the wood out, they invested in International and Caterpillar tractors that would pull the scoots. And they also rigged up one of the large International tractors with a boom, with a huge drum for a winch. And this had the cable would extend out with almost like ice tongs. And they'd pull this cable out and hook onto the log, bring it out to the tote road, scoot road, and then hook the tongs into the center of the log, pick it up and put it on the scoop. And then they'd put in stakes, and of course prior to that it was all done with planks and cant dogs to roll it on, which was bull work, very, very strenuous. And then from crosscut saws, they went to the first big chainsaw, 2-man chainsaw, the motor on one end, and it would pivot so that you could cut down through, and also cut once the log tree was scarfed, then they could tilt the blade and go in and fall the tree. So that expedited now the
Harvesters
production,
and-
rather the harvesting so it met two things. The mill was redesigned so that the power was that much more, and but it was a dangerous environment too. I mean, and some people got seriously injured, as maybe Chest or David Chase will tell you. A fellow by the name of Downs fell into the saw one day and lost his arm and big gash here. And I used to ride with Warren, I think his first name was, in his pulp truck. And he drove that with one arm. It was amazing that he wasn't killed. I mean, it was a horrible, horrible accident. I mean, a lot of the fellas that were wounded and on disability, Keith Brown, who I lived with and I considered more like a brother, Gerald, he was disabled. Harold, he was stone deaf from bombs bursting, around him. And anyway, they were all on a very small disability, and they had families, and hey, if you wanted meat, you had to kill a deer or a rabbit or a partridge or whatever. And the government would provide them with rolled oats, and we have like lard for butter. We would go specifically to Cooper's Mills to Eddie Howe's gun and fur store, and would sell whatever fur would trap to Eddie, and Eddie had quite a collection of firearms, and everybody, if they get hard up, they'd go up and Eddie would buy the gun, and chances are you might end up buying it back. It was like a hawk shop. And we used to, the trapping was pretty crude. We'd do it mostly from the road and culverts, and
what were you trapping at that?
Mink or rats, muskrat. But I can remember on the road to Clary Lake, we call it the roller coaster road, from going out towards Clary Lake Dance Hall. And we had a trap set, and this was back in 1957, 58, 57. And I came up and spent, I don't know how many months here, but I was pretty well broke. But my car was in bad need of tires, so we were running this trap line, and we pulled up to a culvert there right by the lake, and we looked down over the bank, and the trap was gone. So we knew we had something. Anyway, we went down over the bank, and we had a beautiful buck mink. And went in and threw it on the counter. Wasn't skinned, and asked him how much he'd give us for it. And $20. And let me tell you, that was big money then. And that kind of bought me some used tires for the car.
What kind of car did you have?
That was an old convertible Oldsmobile 55 Starfire convertible, I think. It was quite the car at the time. But I was with Gerald Kensel. Gerald's a family from Whitefield, very prominent family. Dexter Kensel, his dad, was living when I was a boy. And, they lived on Townhouse Road. And but Gerald was quite a trapper and woodsman. And unfortunately, Gerald went in the service in the Second World War, and He was disabled, and I'm not exactly sure what happened, but he was in the Air Corps. And most of the young men that went came back pretty well shot up. There was some big brown trout, and they were sea runs, a lot of them down in Alma, down at head tide. But there were some brown trout, and but mostly brook trout from head tide up to going up to Sheepskin.
What about salmon?
Salmon, there were a few. I can't remember great numbers, but there were a couple of pools down in all in head tide that held some salmon, and I've seen them at King's Mills at Ford Mill. This pond would be pretty well full in the spring, and then Chet, in the summertime, he could control the level and drop it some, which may not have been too popular with the people on the lake. But it did concentrate all of the fish in the back of this dam into this, what we call a thoroughfare. And you could fish and catch, actually fill a boat with white perch, yellow perch, hornpout, and pickerel. Fishing was second to none. It was unbelievable. We'd catch 24, 26-inch pickerel. It would be very common to catch big pickerel. Mm-hmm. And there again, if you were fishing with a red and white daredevil pickerel spoon, that's all you would catch. And it was just unlimited. It was quite the thing. And then
you
frogs,
fish up in the reeds?
We'd fish more right in the thoroughfare because the fish were, when he dropped the water down, they'd be concentrated in the actual thoroughfare itself, so you didn't have to fish in the weeds and stuff. Mm-hmm. I may have mentioned to you on the phone that would come up and would catch 50, 60 to 100 frogs for frogs' legs, and would take them back home and would skin them, and would keep all this fish together, trout and pickerel and perch, and would have a huge fish fry when my parents would come up on the weekend. So that was quite a treat. And the frog's legs, of course, a lot of people are pretty squeamish about, but they are excellent. Wonderful, wonderful. Compared to chicken, probably better. But anyway.
Did you ever land a snapping turtle?
We used to catch a lot of snapping turtles down in King's Mills, and I've caught them, probably, I would say 40 pounds. Huge snappers. Elton Libby, who ran the mill in Whitefield, one of the mills, he always carried his rifle with him, and right there off of the, right in back of Lester Felt's store, today I noticed that there was a big rock out in the middle of the river, and every once in a while a big turtle would climb up on that rock, and when Elton would come by, he'd pick it off the rock. And, but I have caught them, just pretty monstrous turtles. Benefits I had from living with the mill crews is that I'd go and I knew all of the woods in town from the mill sites, and when it was hunting time, I knew the town like the back of my hand. I learned a lot about the logging business as a young boy, and I used to drive some of the equipment, and but it was quite an evolution to go from horses yarding wood to seeing it all re-mechanized. This is where Martin Potter used to live there, and I found some old papers there that I provided to the Historic Society that they've just cataloged that were in a tumble-down building, I don't know. And Harold Heath and his family moved in there. I think they squatted after Martin died. But
The Heath Farm here?
yes, this was Joe Heath's, and he was a beautiful farm. And of course, this field, when I was a kid, just before dark, you could see deer in that field almost any time.
You could see deer in the field here?
Oh, almost any evening. I mean, you ride around this town back in those days. I mean, the place was full of deer, you know. And there's still a lot of deer. It's some of the best deer country probably left in Maine. Edna Glidden was the school mom, and she would pick us up down Kings Mills and take us down to the schoolhouse down on the plains, and that was the year I went, in 1946 is when I went to that, and I was then 12 years old. Now here is the Grady house, right here.
Now this is the Hardman.
Joe and Neota. Now Neota and her mother were living here when we lived in the Cheney house next door. And they took, Neota's mother took care of me a lot, I guess. Mm-hmm. And Neota was a school mom and very, very close to the family. And Joe was a painter and paper hanger. And this used to be an old wooden bridge back in the 40s and 50s. I think it was changed in the 60s. But that was Grace Emerson's house up on the knoll there. She was a school mom. And this was Lester Felt's store on the right. And this store was owned by Curtis Coombs. I believe Dick Russell took it over. And then Mrs. Eastman, not Lillian was the daughter, but I can't remember the mother's name. Helen Eastman owned it. And I think she was actually the last proprietor of the store.
Now what kind of goods did they have in the store?
Well, it was a real good country store. I mean, way back they had a big pot-belly stove in there, and people would sit around just like, like in the movies. And the post office was also in this corner on the left of that big picture window. So people would go in, and they had the little pigeonholes for to pick up your mail. And it was pretty well stocked with, the old things, dill pickles, and you could get just about salt pork, all the old things that you'd expect to find in a country store. Tools, mauls, axes. It was very well outfitted. There was like a fish passageway. And in the spring of the year, there was a man that came and placed a box here and trapped eels. And there were hundreds of eels in it. And my uncle was a Swede, and he'd go and catch, take a few of the eels to eat. But anyway, that dam continued all the way across, and as you mentioned, there was a sluiceway down to the left, and the mill set out over the river on, real high granite posts. And this fellow up here where Condon was, he salvaged all those old granite posts. But anyway, the mill set out over the river, and then the old water mill was down in the bowels of the mill. And it was great trout fishing down underneath that mill in those pools in that black bowl of that mill. But out the windows, I could catch fish. So that was quite the, and I used to fish from that rock down there, and there was trout. And, I did catch some salmon here, as I mentioned earlier, just down at the base of the falls there. And I have seen some pretty good salmon jump there, but I didn't have to catch them.
What about lamprey eels?
Lampreys used to come up underneath the mill and up the sluiceway wall, and they'd be attached to the wall, hanging there, and they'd just eventually suck their way up and over the sluiceway. But that sluiceway is what directed the water to the water mill and the water wheel. And the water wheel was constructed out of wood, but the force of that water would turn that wheel, I'm sure, pretty rapidly. It wasn't in operation. I mean, the machinery and the wheel was still there when I was a boy. That was my playground. That old mill, when I was a boy, hadn't been shut down too long. Even the old grist stones were still in place. And this was all clear across the road. There were no trees there. Might have been some poplars down along the river. But the narrow gauge railroad ran right down under the brow here, right down fairly close to the river bank.
Oh, she always brings more than one. She's going up and get a little bit of kindling.
Did you ever ride the narrow gauge railroad?
I don't believe I ever did.
Never did, no. Huh. But you can remember it when I went up through town?
Oh yes, but I was afraid of trains when I was little.
Huh. Yeah, I didn't know that.
I used to. I don't remember. Maybe I did once or twice when I used to board up to Dutton's and with Louise Dutton, Louise Jewett.
Was he the sheriff?
Up to
Dutton?
the house is burned, and went to school up there before they had school for me down on the plains.
Oh, you went to the Plains School?
Yeah.
Huh, I thought you went downtown.
After this one.
But we were talking about how Libby used to give the mill crew the week off for deer hunting. And we'd all drive deer for him. And Libby would shoot deer for all the mill crew. In other words, at the end of the week, everybody would be tagged out. They might not have shot them, but you know, they all had.
I didn't know anything about that.
Is that right? Yeah, we all, I mean, everybody in the mill crew would have a deer to eat at the end of the week. And of course, they couldn't afford to take off any other time. I don't know whether he paid them for that week or not. Those were great times, boy, and I'll tell you, these people joined the war effort, and they really cranked out the wood and the lumber that was necessary for the war effort. You know, you don't think of it, but the packaging, all the stuff with the, you know, the box boards. I mean, to package all the stuff going overseas, you know, and it was a very, very important part of the war machine, you know. Interesting time, you know, but all the young men from town, unfortunately, left here in 17, 18, 19 years old, came back. Sad. Wits End was a Saturday night ritual for, you know, all of the folks here in town. But anyway, my dad took a picture of me in the at the driveway entrance to Wits End, which was owned by Honeybell, and the picture was taken in the wintertime at the entrance to the driveway to Wits End, and in the background was a stack that was part of the decor of the dance hall. Was an old ship. They built a platform, and this stack was part of this designed for the dance hall and the back end of it.
Shaped like a boat. Or,
It was, I don't know whether you could tell from our picture that it was, but that's what it simulated if you were, there was like bench seats along each side of the boat. And I guess you could dance in there, but the main dance hall was, this was like an extension. But Bessie and I can't think of her husband's name. I know it as well as I know my own, but they were originally from New York, and they were all musicians, and they really put on quite a lady of the lake, I'll tell you.
And that was pretty rowdy there.
Oh, it was. They you wouldn't get out of there without a fight. Somebody had to have a fight, The mill crew boys would be down there, and of course, I guess there was always someone that's a little more rugged than another. But it was pretty interesting. Even down the store where we were, all right, they used to come in with a tractor, and they'd have somebody that say, "Well, I can pick the back end of that tractor up," and they'd pick it up. And then they'd add more weight by putting me and then somebody else on the tire until finally only one could lift up the back end of the tractor, with the big hub and everything. It was, quite the thing. And in the woods, the same thing. Who could pick up the biggest log? And, that was...
We forgot to tell about burning the outhouses.
Well... Betty probably remembers a few of those that went down. Did we steal your outhouse one time? Yeah, we stole it.
No, don't take pictures.
It's a job.
Why don't you have a seat and we'll talk about that for a
I've
little
got
bit.
pictures of them.
But we stole
Down-
Keith's.
it was
Keith,
down in the river.
Keith
They
was
got it
the-
out too. Brought it back.
yours did?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I forget
George Chase,
who's, just exactly who's of it. But Keith, of course, was the instigator, and this is Keith Brown. So, anyway, turnabout's fair play, and we went and stole Keith's and put it downtown,
So did you ever go down to Dyer Valley?
Oh, yes, we did. That was a wild dance, too. And young Kenny Jewett, who unfortunately died in an automobile accident, he and I were chums, and they lived right down the road here. But, all the people were very good dancers back then. And my mother was a great dancer. And I learned very early on how to square dance, and we used to, even downtown here, we used to have in the town hall, we used to have some nice dances on the second floor. That old floor would just vibrate. But, things were different then. We used to have game suppers in that building. But actually, I was introduced to liquor back in the war years. These guys from the mill, they'd take me and I'd get probably pretty popped, but my parents never knew it. But anyway, we'd get down and would be half mulled and trying to catch smelts with your hands, falling in the brook, and that was after the dance. That's what would go.